Right, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's session entitled Implementing AI and Machine Learning in R&D, Research and Scientific Organizations. Today's presentation is brought to you by Astrix. It's going to be presented by Dave Dorsett, Principal Software and Systems Architect here at Astrix, who I'm really excited to introduce you to in just a moment. But before we do, let me give you a quick background on who Astrix is on the next slide. And then I'll introduce our speaker. So if you've never been to an Astrix webinar, I want to welcome you. I'm glad you're here. We're certainly happy to have you. If you're coming back to a second webinar or others, we welcome you back. We're glad you came back. We hope you liked what you saw before enough that you came back. So great to have you. So who is Astrix? First and foremost, if you're not familiar with who we are a consulting company. We work predominantly in the R&D and life sciences space. For over 28 years, we brought together a very unique blend of highly specialized strategic and technical services. We bring processes and technology agnostic approach that's made Astrix a very much leading partner globally in transforming the success of life science and science-based organizations in digital transformation. A couple of quick things. We've been at this now since 1995, so 28 plus years. And of the employees we have, 90% of them hold advanced scientific degrees. We are very much a science-based organization that helps other science-based organizations. So that's just a little bit about who we are, a technology consulting firm focused very heavily in the R&D and the life science space. We bring a lot of scientific knowledge to bear. I'll introduce you to one of those in the next slide, actually. So let me take a moment and introduce Dave, our speaker for today. Dave Dorsett's Principal Software and Systems Architect here. He brings over 30 years of experience working predominantly in the R&D informatics space with global pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies, consumer goods, etc. Proven track record of architect, design, delivering both commercial and in-house informatics solutions across the entire R&D spectrum. I've had the pleasure to sit in on a number of webinars with Dave. Very insightful, great presentations. I'm going to sit back, enjoy the presentation like the rest of you. I'll come back on at the end to help with questions, which reminds me, please ask questions as we go through. We will leave a few minutes at the end of the presentation to field as many as we can. Dave, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. Just from that real quickly. So today I'm going to cover a bit of current state and backgrounds to get started, just a little bit of terminology essentially, and a little bit of kind of base level understanding of this overarching AI ML topic. I'm going to talk about a number of different applications I'm aware of in the life sciences R&D space, where AI ML techniques are being actually applied. So I can talk a little bit about how one might go about starting initiatives in the AI ML space, how to keep them going, and then a few comments on sort of watch points or things to be aware of essentially as these efforts move on. First of all, from a background perspective, I just want to say, was just mentioned there, I've done several of these webinars for Astrix to talk with a lot of folks in this industry, R&D leadership, IT leadership, and of all of the different topics I'm generally, in discussions with people on or doing webinars about, this is one of the more challenging ones, just sheerly because of the scope of things that fall under the label of AI ML these days. It's a very, very large domain. It is filled with constant change, constant improvement, constant things going on. It's very challenging, frankly, to really keep up on everything that goes on. I spend probably an hour or so a day just reading top-level headlines, around this topic as well as other topics, and each day that generates 4 or 5 articles or what have you that I'm reading at a little more depth, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed with the rate of progress and the rate of change and discussions and everything else, particularly things labeled AI ML. So organizing this and trying to put this together today, like I said, was a little bit of a challenge, but hopefully in this you will find some useful bits of information and understanding, in a practical sense that can help you actually sort of get your arms around how you might want to proceed or how you might want to, make changes to efforts that you've got ongoing currently, for that matter. So I think it goes without saying that, all the hype and everything that surrounds this, all of the, the constant things in my inbox and blogs I read, et cetera, around happenings is actually backed by, successful stories, by successful systems that have been built that are, fulfilling the promise, which is basically generating outputs from inputs. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And based on sort of cycles of feeding data through systems and reinforcing, knowledge within them and modifying outputs, et cetera. So more or less today, as we stand here within the domain of process R&D, specifically life sciences R&D, as was mentioned earlier, I've done a lot of work with consumer products and petrochemicals and general chemicals as well. But within the process R&D space, the specific successful examples of how AI ML is being applied, in an R&D setting, still remain very narrow in their focus. And we'll talk a little bit more of that as we go through this. The promise of AI, as it was sort of introduced several decades ago, is still some distance away. That promise being, some system that would be effectively self-guiding. You are able to feed, knowledge data into, and it would help you make sense of that knowledge without, sort of being guided more specifically towards what aspects you're looking for, or how to interpret things, et cetera. So that we're still a long way away from what's the term of general AI. But we have a number of success stories. This was actually, I think this was last week, this announcement of a team of folks that came out of Meta. Done some work with protein design models, actually under the guise of Meta. Meta closed that effort down. They took off on their own, doing their own thing now, and they are now calling themselves, they're now founded part of this company called Evolutionary Scale. So this is a protein language model, basically a language for describing protein structure that is actually quite promising, and it's had some interesting applications in and around the development of fluorescent models of proteins. Green fluorescent protein is a very common biotech tool for a variety of different analytical approaches. These guys are using this protein design model to actually try to expand and design novel labeling techniques with fluorescence, inherent fluorescence of proteins, and they've turned up some very interesting things with what they've done. This was just literally, I think it was late last week that this came out, or some point last week, and I read this article. So as I said, it is a rapidly moving, very interesting space in terms of all the things that are actually happening. So a little bit more about that. I think everybody is probably aware, has heard some of the terms. Towards the left here, we talk about, this goes back to this hype cycle definition, goes back many decades as well. Talking about, inflation of expectations around any given new technology. We move into a trough of disillusionment, et cetera, before technologies and the adoption of those technologies actually reaches a more steady state, productive, sort of ongoing usage. This general shape of perception about new technologies and technology adoption has been true for a number of different technical spaces. And I'm not going to spend much time trying to hypothesize here with you about like where AI ML currently sits on this. As I said, from a very practical point of view, AI is being used today. AI techniques are being used to create content, to create useful content in a number of different domains, and that I treat basically factually. I'm not trying to be overly negative about things, nor frankly am I trying to be overly positive about things as well. I think it's important to understand things that the current scope of how we define AI and AI ML, what that is and what it means it can't do. It's not able to fix problems that we have in operating systems and our data. And in fact, we'll talk more about this. The application of AI and ML in our existing infrastructures and life science R&D in particular can actually be an issue based on some of our data challenges and such. And the IML is no magic solution to fundamental data architectural challenges. Direct scientific problem solving. By direct here, I actually really mean like asking the system a question for a direct answer. Give me the best modification to this small molecule to limit cytotoxicity. Asking any kind of AI/ML algorithm those kinds of questions. I'm not saying you won't get an answer, but a direct solution to those types of scientific questions in the domains that we deal with is at the least very scarce. They are not self-defining, peers effectively of experienced scientists. And that really means that human scientists reasoning, problem solving, from an AI perspective, it's just not in the box, if you will, with AI in the current way. And one of the things, I'll elaborate on this a little bit more, that a lot of what we as scientists consider are common sense, right? What you would or wouldn't do to modify a small molecule, a small molecule structure, for example, knowing and with the experience, et cetera, that we have, not necessarily in the wheelhouse of current AI. Some things are, AI can actually amass certain levels of what we might classify as general common sense knowledge in our domain. But, overall, AI models today do not have well-structured sort of, if you will, sort of background boundary conditions or domains around what their outputs actually are. So from a practical point of view, right, we want to actually do some things here with AI/ML. What do we actually need to do this? So I'm going to detour just a minute here, come back to that, and detour just a minute with some background terminology. These are words that get thrown around a lot, especially in the press. The words themselves actually get misapplied, misused, intentionally and unintentionally, frankly, by vendors, by writers trying to sensationalize things, etc. And there's a level of squishiness to some of these terms, and bear with me if your particular background and experience isn't exactly on point with the way I'm presenting things here, because there is some levels of interpretation of these things. But the way I think about these things in general, the topics today, I've kind of ended up focusing on two main topics within this big umbrella of AI. One is generative AI itself. And specifically, I'm using that term here to define AI that is built to create new content based on existing content. Okay? So based on input, which might be, a set of methods, which might be, answers to questions or things along those lines, AI that is actually AI systems that are built to generate and synthesize new content. So this actually has this space of AI has a very long history. Back into the 1960s, there was a system built, a rather famous system called ELIZA, which was a computer psychologist. ELIZA actually has an awful lot to do with me personally and why I do what I do. Having been educated as a scientist, I do computer work now. I had exposure to ELIZA as a 5-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old. My first real exposure to any computers was back on an ASR33 teletype, which I have distinct memories of interacting with this program, ELIZA, in the background, asking me questions about how do you feel, tell me more about, et cetera, et cetera. ELIZA was a rule-based system. Today we would consider this a rather primitive form of a chatbot, but it was basically written to latch on to trigger keywords and key phrases in a human response typed in to the computer and echo back, take certain pathways through a decision tree, basically echoing, tell me more about, et cetera, kinds of things. So generative AI has been around for a long time. So this notion of chatbots and the notion of like computers responding, ideally as if they're humans. More recently, in the last several years, there have been several major advances kind of technically, in this space, generative adversarial networks and the transformer architecture that Google developed in specific that have sort of enabled the class of things that we now call LLMs, large language models, and how those actually work. So Gen AI is ChatGPT, by another name. And these methods that actually take input of large amounts of language, hence the name, large language models, build relationships between the contents that they are given. statistical probabilistic relationships. When somebody is talking about this, typically they follow it up with conversations about this subject, those types of things. That's not a model that has any understanding of semantics or meaning of that content. It's a model of the relationship between things. And so these generative AI systems are not based on any kind of logical reasoning type of capabilities. They are statistical probabilistic explorations of relationships between natural language and large inputs. That's not to say they're not useful, and we'll talk about some applications of these things, but it is important to understand what these things are behind the scenes, right, and how they actually work. And therefore, what kinds of class of problems and such might they be suited to be useful. So that's one big chunk of what AI is today. Obviously a big chunk of what's popular in the press, et cetera, in this. The other specific area that I wanted to talk a little bit about today is in the machine learning space. This is another subcomponent of the overall umbrella of everything in AI. Machine learning, as I'm going to discuss it here, is specifically AI that's used to make predictions and recommendations from a model. So we feed a model, basically, we teach a model. We don't necessarily build a model, we build essentially a meta model, a technique for actually looking at data and building a model of that data. And we then ask that trained model to give us predictions on new data, new inputs, or give us recommendations on categorizations, et cetera, on data, outside of what it was originally trained on. There are two general classes of training, and I won't go into the weeds on this types of things. Two classes of models that can be built here. There's a supervised mechanism where when you feed training data into the ML ML algorithm, you provide inputs and answers. So these values, these forms of structures are cytotoxicity. Have cytotoxicity, for example. Building a model like that. The other way to train ML models is called unsupervised, where you basically just feed all the data to the model, and you let it try to figure out what are predictors effectively, its inputs in the set, and what are not, and predictors of what, in fact, is left open to the model itself. So those are two main sort of subclasses of machine learning techniques. And again, different techniques here of different applications and sort of are based in different roots of our understanding about how to reason and how to work with data. So a little bit of background there on some of the things that you might see in the press, etc. So a little bit more on ML. There are 5 major approaches to ML. That idea that we can feed data, unsupervised or supervised, into some algorithm and have that algorithm learn the data to the point of being able to give us predictions about that. These 5 major approaches, these are the 5 camps effectively today of approaches to that type of machine learning. There's logic programming, symbolic abstract reasoning, which is one of the oldest approaches here. There's connectionist. Oops, I think there's an editing issue here. There's evolutionary school of thought, which is actually genetic algorithms and genetic programming. I'm sure some of you have probably heard those terminologies, in things. There's association-based neuron analogous connectionist programming. So our titles here that are labeled number 2 and number 3 are inverted. So number 2 is actually evolutionary, number 3 is connectionist. Connectionist programming are neural networks. It's another class, basically, of ways that you can construct ML models. There's statistical ways to construct ML models, Bayesian statistics in particular, conditional probabilities. You can, the best example of this particular type of machine learning are spam filters, right, which are built around the relationship between emails that have certain words in them, as the frequency of that word overall and the frequency of that word within spam email messages. And so there's a differential between the use of a word that most spam messages might contain a certain word, and it's that differential statistical probability that's used to sort of rank emails into whether or not it could be spam or has a probability of being spam. So that's a whole other class of machine learning. And then there's also a newer class here called analog class, and this is classification models, support vector programming. This is tensor, the tensor stuff from Google, et cetera. And it's, interestingly enough, there's a few recommendations and pointers to some external references. There's a really good book called The Master Algorithm out there. It's been out for quite a while, actually, which discusses these 5 classes of these 5 schools of machine learning and the search for bridges between these classes. Like what happens if you could put these things together in a way that plays their strengths and weaknesses off each other and develop sort of a master learning algorithm. So a learning algorithm that could literally learn anything. That's ultimately the goal of this type, the folks who work in this kind of space. Like I said, the book is 2019, I think. So it's a few years old, but it's still a very valuable reference. It is not math heavy. So a lot of the details that you can find if you poke around for like, tell me more about neural networks, get very mathematically intense pretty quickly about the theory of backpropagation and all of these other kinds of things that go into this, into building models with those techniques. But this particular book is a good basis. It's got pretty solid underpinnings for how things are really built and what their pluses and pros and cons really are, but without requiring graduate courses in mathematics and discrete algebra and topics like that. So this is a good overview book in terms of the general schools of machine learning and what they're good at doing and how they might actually work together in futures of them. So. All right. So that was a little bit of background. So now I'm not going to go in detail through all of these things. I just wanted to point out that, like I said before in the introduction, the reality today is that we are using AI/ML in a number of different ways within the life sciences industry to do a number of different things or assist with a number of different things. And I've listed a selection of them here. This is not comprehensive. But these are the types of things that are going on in the real world today, where AI/ML is either a fairly significant part of the work that goes on, or a growing part of the work that goes on. There's interesting things happening. So on the discovery side, de novo design, pull that out. That paper that I had on the initial screen there of the folks at Meta who have now sort of done this new AlphaFold from Google's another example of work in de novo protein design that is being guided or principally driven by AI techniques in this. Analysis of candidate screening data for optimization kinds of things. Back in part of my history, I worked in the material science space, new material research and development, new material research in particular. And we use GAs to actually optimize evolutionary, sort of convergence, if you will, ideally convergence, on the kinds of material properties that we were actually looking through. So we wrote systems using genetic algorithms, defining cost functions that represented sort of where we wanted the evolution of those materials to actually go. So that's a technique. That's another discovery level technique that's been around. That's not a life science application, but it's a good example of a real practical world, kind of use of AI that is actually happening. In the non-clinical research space, there's a lot of particularly toxicology prediction. It's seen a lot of work, model development in the tox space, cytotoxicity, et cetera, has been there's been a lot of tremendous advance in that space over the last several years. And in fact, a lot of folks now use algorithms and models in these physical, chemical, and toxicological liability and property prediction space as common screening techniques, in early development / non-clinical spaces. So a lot of good stuff actually in that space as well. Clinical, this is not my area of expertise, to be clear, but I'm aware of quite a bit going on in the clinical, particularly like trial recruitment and adherence and retention within trials. So dealing with identification of aspects of trials, of the trial populations where adherence and retention is potentially an issue, and sort of bringing those kinds of issues in the clinical trials to light so that they can be remediated, hopefully. So recruitment and selection, looking at population statistics and where likely what type of likely populations would be suitable for clinical trial testing based on goals is another area in the clinical space where AI ML models are being used, being built and being used. Development and manufacturing, this is kind of an interesting space in that, it tends to be a high inertia space for us as an industry, meaning that change in the space is relatively slow, the rate of change. And a lot of that has to do, of course, with the regulated aspect of things, which kind of pushes a conservative viewpoint towards this. But there's some interesting things nevertheless actually going on. Identification, trending, monitoring of critical process and quality parameters is really, an area where I see a tremendous amount of interest and work going on in the industry for how can we better organize, starting with the development processes, how can we better organize our data, building models, to actually to assist the scientists in actually identifying the truly critical process and quality parameters. We see from a manufacturing point of view, this is the goal here is to make sure that the things you do identify and file on are truly, in fact, critical, related to product quality, and that you're not overstating that, and you're also not understating that, and that's a very tricky proposition to actually pull out factors that are orthogonal, to each other, that are truly related to critical product quality. And there's a lot of data to sift through, and it's semi-structured data sometimes, and it has interesting relationships to each other. And so there's a tremendous amount of interest and people experimenting, I will say, in the space of like what could we do in that space using AI ML to better assist our ability to do a better job, essentially, in that part of things. Again, this is development into manufacturing as well. There are also some general, what I'll call general purpose, so not so much related to the life cycle of drug discovery and development, but some general purpose things where AI is being applied in life sciences. So, better enablement of data governance, workflow, meaning, fundamentally the operational aspects of capturing data in a lab and bringing things together, integration kinds of problems. Essentially, there are some interesting applications of some AI ML techniques, essentially, in categorizing and classifying data to better integrate, better offer, more rapid or more on-point integration of data, particularly across systems. Data tagging and harmonization, this is also partially related to those integration problems I just mentioned before, and I'll talk about this a little bit more towards the end as well. And improvements to data classification and search. Search is one of those things that, everybody has agreed that it's a major problem. Finding data, findability of data in our world is a critical issue, still largely unsolved. Despite a large number of efforts over many decades, a lot of approaches, and acronyms, and pre-competitive groups working as a working as a consortium, et cetera, to try to improve this, we still struggle with findability of our data. And so there's a lot of interest in could some aspects of ML in particular and unsupervised learning in more specificness actually help us with findability of data. So that's another very interesting problem space. Okay, again, I won't drain all this here. Just specifically thinking about the GMP space here, there is interest in how models built, again, through machine learning, typically here we're talking about real machine learning kinds of things as opposed to generative AI applications, but how machine learning approaches, might actually help in the various aspects of GMP work, which are sort of loosely simplified here, categorized basically about the kinds of benefits or kinds of problem statements that one might actually I think look to ML as being let's explore how ML could assist in automated QC. Let's explore how ML could actually assist in preventative maintenance. That's one that I know, not a life sciences application, but my daughter actually worked in the application of ML to preventative predictive preventative maintenance, predictive machine failures, basically on semiconductor manufacturing floors. So there's definitely interesting aspects there, you know, in that part of the, you know, how to use ML techniques essentially in optimizing those aspects of manufacturing and quality. Okay, a little more, again, more detail. You'll have this material actually read through and look through. But this is all sort of batch release oriented, you know, at potential applications of AI ML. You know, some of which I think I already just touched on a little bit, but some of which actually expand into interesting parts of the third-party manufacturing chain, like reviewing of contracts and evaluations of suppliers, how that might actually be assisted by some of these AI ML techniques. You know, and there, you know, potentially generative AI might have some influence to be able to look through contracts and look through statements of service levels and those types of things to find those types of patterns and relationships between, you know, successful supplier chains and unsuccessful supplier chains. So that those are a whole raft of ideas, and like I said, there's a variety. You know, I'm aware of a number of different things and that fall into a number of those categories. It's not exhaustive. There's a lot of other stuff also going on, sort of under this very large umbrella of AI/ML within our space. You know, I think somewhere in there, most people would find, oh yeah, those are interesting problems that we would like to solve, or those are high priority things for us. You know, based on our strategic objectives, we'd like to be able to get on, you know, to put together an effort to actually work on these types of things. So where do you start? The $64,000 question here. Where do I start? So I know where I want to be. I kind of know where I am. I'm definitely not where I want to be. How do I actually get off the ground? AI in all the forms, and basically I think I already said this, but I will restate it more succinctly, that all of AI, all of this is data driven. All of this is data gated. AI's fundamental requirement, all of the techniques that we have today require data. And it's steadier, you know, more than data actually requires AI. Meaning, you know, with data we can do a lot of things, tactical things like, you know, enable reporting, enable review by exception, these types of things. Those aren't AI applications; those are data-oriented, you know, approaches that have ROI to them. But if you're going to do AI, you're going to do AI ML. You've got to have data to actually drive the whole bus. And it's not just an amount of data. It's actually an amount of data that is relevant to the problems that you're in, the models that you're trying to build. Meaning, data quality is not an option. Poor input, poor output. We have a million different ways of saying that in this industry: garbage in, garbage out, etc. With AI ML, because of the function of the way a lot of these models and these techniques function, they can become black boxes, meaning that it's very difficult to understand how a given set of inputs leads to that particular recommendation from an ML system. We're used to, in statistical modeling, in things like statistical process control, being able to do things like sensitivity analyses, where we vary inputs and understand what impact that has on outputs. AI/ML models are generally pretty resistant to those types of analyses. And, you know, it is, and to a large extent, bad inputs cannot just generate bad outputs. They can generate, you know, false, what the press calls hallucinations of models, right? Very confident statements by the models that, in fact, are so wildly off base, that they, you know, don't really have relationship to anything that would actually be in reality. And so data quality with respect to AI, data quality is important for those tactical things I was talking about before: reporting, review by exception, all those types of applications. In AI, the type of data quality we're talking about is it's another level, essentially, quality, comparability, etc. So it's not just about digitalization, like, is the data available to a computer model, right? Does it exist in a form that can be ingested? It's about, is it structurally comparable? You know, is it organized in a way that, you know, data from a year ago, the pool data from a year ago and today are actually structurally similar enough to be useful? by a model, and are they semantically comparable? Meaning, do they mean the same things? When we talk about the way we would characterize impurities in a batch, is that comparable over large amounts of time in order to be able to be used by a model that's trying to generate, some application of the relationship between impurity profiles and final target product profiles. Gen AI as a topic, apart from ML, can work with what I'll call less mature data, meaning that the nature of Gen AI itself lets you, feed it a wider variety of things. Since it's a probabilistic model, it is still subject to influences, omission, and bias. Meaning, if you don't give it information about a topic, it's not going to know anything about the topic. So omission can be an issue when you're trying to use generative AI to create or suggest new content. Bias in your input is also another critical issue with generative AI, and there's a lot of popular press discussion about this now because of the way that the large consumer-focusing models like ChatGPT are trained. They are subject to bias. We know that data sets that in existence in general, public data sets and such. I'm not talking about scientific data sets. I'm talking about popular data sets have biases to them, and we as humans, work in a way that arguably most of the time work in a way that has some level of understanding of those types of biases. These models don't necessarily possess that, so they can be led astray pretty easily. In the scientific applications of Gen AI, that type of bias might be less of an issue. We have other types of bias, but if you're going to attempt to do things like feed a long-term history of methods, for example, into a large language model in order to, find ways of categorizing methods for a new target, this omission and bias, these omission and bias issues definitely are things that have to be considered in terms of identifying the appropriate data streams. All right, so all that said about data, how would I really go about starting? Okay, I get, want to do all these things, and I have to put data together if I want to try to do AI ML things. How do I actually start? And here I'm pointing at a slide that was from the last webinar that I was involved with a gentleman by the name of Ken Raish from Astrix. We talked where the discussion was about lab of the future, hence the title here, and sort of ways that people are organizing themselves and initiatives around these labs of the future. And one of the things that we suggested, which is based on the Astrix practice here for strategic direction assessment as part of these types of initiatives, I'm going to point here not in detail, but at two pieces of work that come out of these types of strategic assessments. And these are the conceptual data and system reference architecture pieces. This is the building of a high-level data architecture across a domain or set of domains that actually describes the fundamental building blocks, right, across systems in a system-independent manner, right, that are the nouns, I guess, if you will, the entities of which that are important to whatever work we're actually sort of working on. This type of definition of data architecture, is the reduction of a lot of the details of our LIMS systems and ELN systems, all these other things that we've got, into what are these systems really speaking about and how are they speaking of them. So these are the fundamental relationships, for example, between material and batch and sample and container and a COA in terms of like limits and parameters that are actually tested and measured. It tends to be something that's simple to talk about and simple to understand, like getting agreement on what's a material, what's a batch, and what's a sample, and what's a result, et cetera, seems like, kind of a simplistic, trite thing to say. Pulling this off in practice can be really, really challenging, and especially pulling it off in a way that is high level, that is cross-system, not system dependent. But in terms of like being able to prepare yourself for the data expectations and data needs of AI ML, it's absolutely critical. The kinds of data we're going to want to operate are not in the possession of a single system. You're going to need to be able to speak cross-system. You're going to need to look at problems in more of an end-to-end scientific way, data in an end-to-end scientific way, And to get to that level of understanding of the data and realization of the data, you're going to have this kind of a framework so that you understand what this language is, across your systems. So in terms of like things that you really need to do in order to execute on AI ML programs, this type of high level conceptual reference architectures are pretty good. Some very specific thoughts related to data architecture and AI ML. Provenance of the data, which is always an important thing to us in science, is of particular importance for AI ML. So, we want to be able to understand what models are good at doing and to use models appropriately. We want to understand from where this data that they're actually being trained on and used in the ML space is from where that data actually comes, right? And part of that is the forensics that may need to happen afterwards. Why was that conclusion? Why did that conclusion come out of the model? What specifically should I go look at as a scientist in order to understand whether or not that suggestion from the model, from an ML model, was a good thing or not? So that provenance, like where did this data come from? What's the relationships, et cetera? How is it changed? And all that is a critical aspect in ML applications within the life sciences industry. So part of your data architecture needs to speak strongly to how this is being maintained, how provenance is actually being maintained. So that's one, I think, critical sort of general comment, I guess, across the, what you should be thinking about from a data architecture for AI and ML. The other thing is trying to help folks avoid, the trap of seeking perfection in things. Some data is better than none. You've got to expect you're going to iterate, right? You don't know the effort required to put together data in a comprehensive sense to be able to test it, to try to build a model, test a model's capabilities for answering questions, et cetera. You need to find ways to iterate and chunk those problems down into more meaningful things. So there's a lot of phrases that go, this perfection being the enemy of good, et cetera. Here, I think we all pretty much agree with those kinds of statements and this kind of a goal when it comes time to talking about the projects that we're doing or setting up our projects. In practice, this is a trap that folks fall into. Team after team that I work with fall into the rabbit holes, around attempting to perfect, this aspect of data or that aspect of data, and miss opportunities, I believe, in realizing that you don't have to go all the way down the rabbit hole to answer, to have everything in a completely quantified state, where just simply being able to connect more of the data, albeit at a higher level, can actually give you enough to actually start iterating. So, however you want to look at this, like I said, perfection being the enemy of the good, procrastination being spelled perfectionism. But one of the big encouragements I would give you on the front of data architecture is that, waiting around to develop the right full-blown model for all this stuff is tempting, but not necessary. And actually, no matter how much time and energy you put into it, you're going to get it wrong anyway. So you start iterating as soon as you can around the data. And that actually goes for your model building as well. Okay, some more notes on things within the data space that get a lot of discussion amongst us, particularly when trying to use data for AI purposes. We talk a lot about structured versus unstructured data. And to some extent, I think maybe there's a little too much obsession going on about this. Some of the more interesting particularly recent developments in the LLM space, the introduction of RAGs, retrieval augmentation generation, which is basically giving an LLM the ability to look at structured data, as source of facts, essentially. The idea here is that we might be able to restrain some of the statistical intent, the probabilistic understanding of Gen AI, to look at just associations between things. If we were able to tell it facts about, well, X and Y are never related, or X is always related to Z from a factual standpoint, the kinds of things we would find in our relational databases, right? We find that, when you do this kind of work, these are the kinds of quality attributes that actually come out. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with good applicability in our space right now, augmenting LLMs with these retrieval augmented generation or factual links. And there was a really interesting announcement last week, which I've only just read through like the first time, so still need to reread it and think about it some more. But Microsoft Research actually announced some interesting work that they've done recently about how to better represent spreadsheets in an LLM tokenization pipeline. Spreadsheets are quite problematic today for large language models in Gen AI. Our human understanding when we look at a spreadsheet is very different than the machine's just ability to tokenize. Think about reading a spreadsheet from the upper left to the lower right across your rows, right? How much do you really learn about what the spreadsheet is telling you as opposed to the kind of, conceptual movement that a human or a scientist does between columns and rows, right? The cell-based kind of structures and such. And so how to tokenize and how to represent spreadsheets and tables in these large language models has been a real struggle. And there's, I don't know, like I said, I need to reread this article again, but it's an interesting approach that seems to augment, sort of some of the things that we think of meaning that tables convey, in a better way from an LLM perspective. And being able to do this could potentially have immense impact in the life sciences industry. So much of our documents, method documents, what have you, are full of tables, of data. And if there was Gen AI was better able to understand tables, this would be a very interesting, could be a very interesting augmentation. The finance industry is even potentially more impacted by this, since everything in that industry is Excel. But these are the kinds of interesting things going on in Gen AI that I think have really potentially interesting application in life science. All right, some notes on organizational aspects of AI. So pulling this off in a practical organization. Traditionally, there's a couple of models that people pursue. You build a center of excellence, and a center of excellence typically is built around the technical people who can build models and understand how to write the right Python code and use TensorFlow and all those types of things, as opposed to the applications of that. And the other extreme is a decentralized business unit model where everything is driven essentially by the applications, and the depth arguably is a little less. And I don't think it's not rocket science here to understand that what we really need to do in this particular industry specifically is a combination of the two things. We want things to be science-driven. We need things to be science-driven. So we need to let the science, the business, quote unquote, find, rank, define, assess these applications. They need to describe to us what are the logical inputs and outputs, what are the logical sources of data, what is the level of quality of that data. Those are scientific level aspects to doing these things. The use of the technology, that's something that can be definitely centralized. In fact, there's arguments definitely for centralizing that, because understanding, for example, the ins and the outs of Bayesian statistical models and the details of LLMs and back propagation mechanisms and neural networks and all these other kinds of things, this is highly, highly technical stuff. But on its own, it's not gonna like help help understand how life science data could actually be productively. So focusing on building the value from the science point of view, not the technology. All right, wrapping up. So I think I kind of suggested this when I was going through some of the applications and some of the recent developments and some of the comments there on data architecture. These are some things I think that are really interesting applications for this industry, for folks in this industry to consider digging in on. Classification and organization of large sets of data using the LLM RAG augmentation I was speaking to just a moment ago. Findability is definitely still a huge problem. I think these techniques here, which are reaching the level of things that you can actually run in your data center. So you're not going to be in a world, I think, very much longer. I think this year will be a big sea change in being beholden to shipping your data in one way or another to platforms like OpenAI in order to use these tools. That's changing very rapidly. My computer here, I can ingest all of Wikipedia into an LLM, with some of these techniques, run it locally, run it entirely locally. And that avoids some of the problems of data leakage and data confidentiality and some of the other things we're definitely concerned about in this industry. But using these kinds of techniques, LLM RAG techniques around looking at findability problems in the life sciences, using those kind of techniques to how to generate metadata and tag our data, like feeding essentially and through these models, the history of instrumentation data, might be an interesting avenue to being able to find appropriate tags to put against that data so that I can find it in the future by something other than the path to the data on a file system. I think automation of data quality assessments is an interesting application in sort of the reference data kind of space, right? So how do we know whether or not we've got appropriate harmonization of terms, right? Looking at things like, in your method, you called this output water content, and this other method, it was labeled as, moisture content. And this is a trivial example, but looking at those kinds of harmonization problems. But we know the two might be related because they're both spoken of as being generated by Carl Fisher. So hey, there's an interesting relationship here, and that's something that these types of models could actually help discover and help guide some of our other data governance and data harmonization problems and data quality assessments by being able to look at the data in those types of ways. I've already spoken to a lot of this, and I'm wary of the time here. I think, again, back to the sort of the hype cycle and stuff, I think in general, there's a lot of very good things that AI ML can provide to the life sciences today. Those should be viewed, I think it's fairly simplistic and rational to understand that those are suggestions that have to be pursued by scientists and SMEs. There are issues of model transparency and explainability that mean that you can't just take what a model does and say, oop, that's the answer. We need to do what works still in this industry, and I think that using these techniques in appropriate ways and understanding the limitations of the techniques, like the fact that LLMs tend to not say, I think, or maybe, they tend to make statements that appear to be, confident. and you need to understand that by understanding the way these models, these systems actually work, and being subjected to bias, for example, in their data, gives you an understanding of how to use that kind of information, I think, in a productive way. So this is an obvious set of watch points for AI ML applications. And then a final set of watch points, in which I'm kind of not suggesting that I think we should be going here, but from a validation perspective, incorporating AI ML data, into validated processes is also fraught with its own large set of issues, especially given, learning cycles, or whatever you want to call it, sort of self-learning models or adjusted learning models, iterative learning models. Our traditional CSV processes where, we test inputs and outputs, if the model itself is varying during this, it's a very difficult thing to test in the framework that we currently have around system validation. There's a lot of the regulatory agencies know this, and are working on, like, what does this mean, and have working groups assembled around AI ML in the regulated spaces. But again, this is a watch. This is definitely. Okay, that was a lot of material. Like I said at the beginning, this is a huge, huge, huge space. I tried to lay out, some of the background, some of the things I know that people hear about, some of the applications I'm aware of, like in this industry, not complete on any of those fronts. And then, my attempts at some practical things if you're going to try to do some AI ML applications, these are the things you really need to think about how to move forward.
Okay. That's great, Dave. Appreciate it. Very comprehensive. And yeah, it is kind of a boil the ocean type scenario. You got to be careful about how much you want to cover in one particular presentation. There's quite a bit there. Again, as I mentioned to the folks in the beginning, if you had any questions you wanted to ask as we went through, if you have questions now, you just type it in on the Q&A section, the question section of GoToWebinar, and we can read that out loud. Again, a reminder for the folks who might not have been in right at the beginning. We recorded this, so we will take this and put this on our YouTube channel. When you get the email for that, it'll give you direct access to watch this video, but it'll also give you access to the channel. You'll see everything that we have in there. We've got well over 125 on-demand sessions that we've done over the past few years here to take a look at. In there, we'd certainly encourage you to subscribe to the channel so you get alerts when new ones come in. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get the recording stopped.